Suffolk River Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the history and heritage of southeastern Virginia, is proud to present specifically Screwpiles by Larry Saint. Larry is a Smithfield, Virginia financial advisor and a foundation board member with a passion for the cottage-style lighthouses distinctive to the Chesapeake Bay and its estuaries. We know that it's the heart and history that makes it heritage. Larry, can you tell us when and how lighthouses, specifically Screwpile lighthouses, won your heart? Have lighthouses always been part of your life?
I can't say that they have always been. It's always been a mild interest, but nothing really serious. Until about 2 years ago, when I was at a board meeting at Carla Smith's house for Suffolk River Heritage Organization. And Carla Smith, of course, is the president of the organization. We're going over a number of different projects. And Carla always has such interesting things at our house. So I was going over books and charts and photos and so on. And I found a set of plans for a lighthouse. And they turned out to be the original Mylar plans for the Nansemond River Lighthouse. And they just fascinated me from the beginning. And I was between projects. I had finished a model of a boat that I was working on, and I was looking for something else to do. And I looked at the plans and I said, I can build that. And I'd like to build that.
Did you have any knowledge of the Nansemond River Lighthouse, what it was, or when
mild
it was
knowledge,
there?
yeah, only just from, there's lots of depictions of Screwpile lighthouses locally. The Nansemond River Lighthouse are used prominently by the Suffolk River Heritage Organization. And so I knew of it from that standpoint, but nothing more. Didn't know anything about the history of it. So I had a vague understanding of what it looked like, but that was about it. And the plans fascinated me. So I thought, I can build this lighthouse, and I'd like to build it, so I want to take this on as a project. And I've never told this to Carla, but I decided then to do it in secret, not tell anybody, and to reveal it to her when it was done as a surprise, and to do it for Suffolk River Heritage. So
and was she surprised?
She was surprised, yeah. Yeah.
Now, you built this very precisely to scale.
It's half inch to the foot scale. And I decided on that for a number of reasons. One of them is it just comes out to a nice size, a size that can be displayed, a size that can be also transported fairly easily, but also a size that has enough detail that you can really accurately depict what the lighthouse looked like.
Now, you have very accurately depicted the interior as well as the exterior in most cases. How did you research that?
Visits to other lighthouses. There were 3 other Screwpile lighthouses around the Chesapeake Bay, at Sullivan's Island, at St. Michael's, and at Thomas Point. And I visited not Thomas Point, but the other 2. Took photographs, also from books. There's lots of books around documenting what Screwpile lighthouses looked like. So I used those and did research. And mostly the inside of the lighthouses were fairly Spartan. They weren't decorated much. They were very simple. They were clean. And so it wasn't difficult to scale everything on the interior.
Now, Screwpile lighthouses were pretty distinctive to the Chesapeake Bay area and the rivers around the bay, from what I understand. Why is that? Is it because of the Screwpiles themselves?
It's because of the bay itself and the bottom structure. They were used mostly in shallow water. Many of them were used to replace what were in place, lightships that were in place. And they were also easy to construct, they were inexpensive to construct, and they were fast to construct. And at the time, there was a high demand, there was a need for more lighting on the bay because water traffic was increasing. There was the advent of the steamship, travel by steamship. People got around mostly around the Chesapeake Bay by steamship, and so there was demand from ship captains, commercial ship captains, crabbers, and others to put in place more lighting for safety. And so that's where the demand grew from. In total, there were about 110 or so Screwpile lighthouses built around the United States. Close to 50 of those were in the Chesapeake Bay.
And what time frame are we talking about?
Early 1800s to, the last one I think was constructed in the late 1800s, 1890s or so.
And how long did they last?
Till about the early 1930s.
And what happened then?
The electric light came along, automation came along. And so your Screwpile lighthouses, all lighthouses, were not inexpensive to staff and to maintain. And so when the electric light came on board in the early 1900s, the ability to automate lighthouses, the Coast Guard decided we need to replace these to save money, to save maintenance costs, and so they started replacing the lighthouses with automated electric lights.
Do we know what the last standing Screwpile lighthouse was in our area here?
Well, Thomas Point is the only one in the Chesapeake Bay region that is still standing and being used as a light beacon. That's the only Screwpile lighthouse that's still being used.
How do you explain the popularity of these lighthouses now? People have always looked to the Hatteras type lighthouse,
right,
but suddenly these are becoming very popular.
But there's a certain charm in these cottage-style lighthouses that isn't there with the large Hatteras-style lighthouses. They have their own interest and fascination, but these have a certain charm to them that I think is important, and that's what attracts people.
Now, in your work, you've also done some work on the lighthouse keepers.
We have, yeah,
Research on that?
actually the research honestly is just begun. We've developed a list of lighthouse keepers for the 4 James River Screwpile lighthouses. And we started to do some ancestry work, discovering where they were born, who their families were, and so on. But we have a lot more work to do in uncovering what their lives were like, how long they were lighthouse keepers, what their families were like, what they did before, what they did afterwards. But more importantly, what was their life like while they were had the job of keeping the light on the lighthouses.
And isn't it true this is one of the first jobs that women could get with the government?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I know that there were about over 100 women that were lighthouse keepers while lighthouses were staffed. The Nansen River Lighthouse had at least one female lighthouse keeper, and her name was Ella Edwards, and she succeeded her husband, who was lighthouse keeper for about 3 years. She succeeded him for about 3 years after that.
It must have been a lonely life.
It was difficult. You know, just reading some of the logbooks, the life on board wasn't easy. One sign of that was they had monthly inspections. So inspector came on board once a month, looked at it and noted in the logbook and his reports what the condition of the lighthouse was. And so maintenance and upkeep was a daily chore. Of course, lighting the lamp every day, maintaining that was really important. But the maintenance and upkeep was ongoing and difficult.
And what did they do for water, for fresh water?
They used rainwater. The rain ran onto the roof. Gutters directed the rainwater into cisterns that were inside. There were typically 4 cisterns inside the lighthouse. And you can imagine the problems with that, because they used lead-based paint back then. There were things like seagull droppings on the roof, and so they had a problem with clean water. It wasn't uncommon to have a lot of dirt and debris in the water. And so as soon as they could, they replaced those cisterns with tanks, and they brought in water. But before that, it was just water off the roof.
And what about heating the lighthouses?
Well, a potbelly stove, sometimes 2. Nansen River Lighthouse and the other 3 lighthouses on the James River had 1 potbelly stove each. So you imagine on a cold February night what it was like.
Had to have been brutal.
The lighthouses were not insulated. And so they would relegate themselves to the kitchen where the potbelly stove was and stay there overnight during cold nights.
And how did these lighthouses fare in a storm?
Well, not so well, actually. Screwpile lighthouses were especially vulnerable to ice flows, destruction by ice flows. Many of the Screwpile lighthouses on the Chesapeake Bay were damaged severely, had to be rebuilt, or some were swept away by ice flows. So storms were a problem, especially winter storms.
Mm-hmm. You've done a lot of work researching the history of lighthouses in general.
I have, yeah. I've done some background just in looking back to see how long have lighthouses been around, how did they start, and so on. What was the lighthouse development? What was the illumination development?
What was the earliest lighthouse that's been recorded?
The lighthouse that was built by Ptolemy just after Alexander died in Egypt in the 3rd century BC. That was the first really notable lighthouse that we have historic records for.
And what fueled that lighthouse?
A great big fire, basically. Lighthouses were mostly fueled from the early days, the Greek periods, through the Roman periods, up until late 1600s, early 1700s, by big fires, or a coal fire. But basically they were just tall structures with a big fire on top.
That had to be a little difficult to maintain.
Yeah, well, you think of Pharos of Egypt, that's what that lighthouse was called. That was in operation from about 300 BC to about 1400 AD. So it was there for about 1700 years. And you imagine, it was 110 meters tall, so you imagine the work needed to keep a fire going all night, bring wood up all the way up, 110 meters up, and imagine the soot and smoke resulting from that fire and how difficult it was to maintain every day.
So what was the next development after the open fire lighthouses?
Yeah, well, from the early time, 300 BC, right through to about 1700. Like I said, it was mostly fires. After that, they started to develop lamps. They used candles or a series of lamps, and notably what was called a spider lamp. And a spider lamp consisted mainly of a bin of oil and some floating wicks. And so they'd have 10, 12, 15, 18 of these that were sitting there suspended in front of the window with all these things lit. And that was the best illumination they had in the late 1600s.
What kind of oil did we use?
Whale oil.
Whale oil?
Principally whale oil, yeah.
Was there anything to reflect the light?
They tried various things then, but the reflectors weren't effective, and they got dirty from soot too easily. So mostly they were just those lighted spider lamps. And they
So
were,
how long were whale oil spider lamps used? Was that a brief thing, or?
well, that was used until about 1780 or so. And in 1780, the development of the argan lamp came along. It was developed in France, and it was a significant development in lamp technology.
Can you describe one for us?
Sure. Instead of being a single wick, which is usually a flat wick about this wide, or just a circular wick, what the Mr. Argan, who was a Swiss physicist, developed was a circular wick. So it was a tubular wick. And the idea of that was that it would have a flow of air in the interior and the exterior. And so by doing so, it increased the candle power, also reduced the amount of fuel that was required, reduced the amount of soot that was generated. It was much more efficient. And candle power increased from about 1 candle power, which is typical of just a single candle power, or a single wick lamp, to about 6 to 7 candle power. So it was a significant development, and it swept through Europe at the time. Thomas Jefferson was ambassador to France at the time. He was so excited about it that he shipped 3 of them back to the United States.
And where did he put them?
He gave 2 away, kept 1 for himself. But it was that exciting that it noted Thomas Jefferson's attention, who of course was a scientist himself.
So how long did they use these particular lamps?
Until about the late 1800s. Early 1900s, actually.
And then what happened?
After that, it was adopted to use a mantle. In early 1900s, the argan lamp added a mantle to it. And the mantle's similar to what the Coleman lanterns are. You have a little mantle there that glows. Yeah, that was developed in the early 1900s. And that increased the candle power from about 6, which was the argan lamp, which was a significant development in itself, to about 60 candle power. It was an enormous development. And then from there, they added wicks and they added more mantles. So the larger mantle-driven argan lamps went to 5 concentric wicks, 2 or 3 mantles, and it increased the candle power from 60 to about 600.
Tell us about the lenses they used in the lighthouses.
Well, the early lenses were not very effective at all. They were just big convex lenses, and they were heavy. They were not easily made. They got dirty easily. They were hard to focus. They had a long focal length, meaning from the lamp source to the lens was a large distance, and that was a problem. And so they were used some, but they weren't used consistently because the light keepers didn't like them. In 1820, Augustine Fresnel developed what is called now the Fresnel lens. And the Fresnel lens was an enormous development in lens technology, because what it did was more effectively focus light from the lamp source going out to the mariner. Before that, the reflector and argand lamp that was used captured about 20% of the light. With the Fresnel lens, it captured about 85% of the light. So much more of the light was captured and sent out to the mariner. So it was much more efficient, much brighter.
This led to a greater projection length of over the water?
It did, yeah. It could be seen for longer distances. It was brighter for longer distances. It was much more effective in fog. It was much more effective in cloudy conditions. So it was an enormous development. And interestingly enough, the United States Lighthouse organization did not adopt that. They resisted that in the early 1800s.
Why?
Because C.S. Lewis, who had developed the Lewis lamp, which was based on the argan technology, it was an argan lamp with a reflector in the back and a convex lens in the front. He developed that so he'd have 3, 4, 5, 7 of those in a circle. And he had contracts with the Lighthouse Board to place those in all of the United States lighthouses in the early 1800s. And while in Europe, they adopted the Fresnel lens very quickly after late 1820s, so that they were widely used very quickly throughout France and England.
When
the
did
United
we
States
make the switchover in this country?
1850s. The first one was put in place in 1841 at Navesink Light in New Jersey. But there was still resistance. In 1850, there was a big shakeup. Congress demanded that there'd be an investigation into the Lighthouse Board at the time because they were getting complaints about inefficiencies, lighthouses not being lit properly, not being lighted properly, I'm sorry, and so on. So they launched an investigation. There was a large report published by Congress which uncovered a lot of inefficiencies in the lighthouse service up to that point. So they created a lighthouse board, and the board swept through many changes. One of them being that they said we will adopt the Fresnel lens throughout our lighthouse system, and they did.
For all types of lighthouses?
For all lighthouses, yeah. They even the smaller lighthouses where there were, up until then, they used what was called a pressed glass lens, which is based on the Fresnel technology, but it was not as efficient as a 6th order or 5th order Fresnel lens. So they were replaced.
Weren't the Fresnel lenses very expensive compared to the other lenses that
They
used?
were much more expensive, but in the long run, they were cheaper and gave a better result because the amount of light, as I said earlier, that was captured by the Lewis lamp was about 20%. The Fresnel lens captures about 85%.
Was there any extra maintenance involved with the new lenses?
Actually, probably less maintenance than what they had earlier, and they were more easily maintained because with the Lewis lamp, it was harder to keep it reflected accurately. It's harder to keep the lens clean. With the Fresnel lens, you had one lamp capturing 85% of the light, so it was much simpler and easier, much more efficient.
Were these used with the mantle type of light behind them?
They were later, but early on it was just the argand lamp, usually a single lamp, some larger than others depending on what size lens it was, but it was just the argand lamp. But that was enough because the lens captured so much of the light, it magnified it so efficiently that it was very effective.
Looking at the Nansemond River light, how far would that project a beam over the water?
About 5 miles. And the James River there is about 5 miles wide, so it was an effective way to...
So the placement of these lighthouses was based on how far the light would reach and where the most dangerous areas of the river were?
Yeah, it was where the most dangerous areas of the river were. And usually it was solicited by steamship companies who saw problems in navigation, and so they would solicit Congress to put a lighthouse in place. That's how most of them were put in place.
So the Nansemond River light was standing for how long?
From 1878 to 1935.
Is there any part of it still visible?
No, it's all gone.
All gone.
In 1935, they dismantled the Cottage, and they replaced it with just a spider steel frame automated light.
Is that what replaced most of the
Yeah.
Screwpiles?
Most of them were, some were taken down completely. Others, they just took the Cottage away, kept the foundation structure, kept the pilings, and then built on top of that just a steel skeleton structure with an automated light on top.
Was the time frame for the Screwpiles about the same as that for the lightships?
Well, lightships actually lasted a little bit longer than Screwpile lighthouses in some places because they were difficult to replace. During the early days of lighthouses, lightships were more common. Willoughby Spit is a good example. That was the first lightship that was put into place in the United States about 1820. They had problems keeping it in place because of storms. Lightships were also expensive to build. They were expensive to maintain. They had a crew of 9 or 10 people. And again, they were subject to storms. So when the Screwpile Lighthouse design was understood to be effective, less expensive, a lot of the lightships were replaced by Screwpile lighthouses. Willoughby is the first example of that. With my recent interest in lighthouses, one of the things that I've been fascinated about is the development of lamp technology over a 140-year period from late 1700s to about the 1820s. It was a fascinating period of lamp development because remember that before that, for 2,000 years, lighthouse illumination was basically a big fire on a tall structure. But that stopped, the development really started in about 1780 with the development of the argand lamp. And the argand lamp was important because what it did was it increased the candle power of the lamp illumination while decreasing the amount of fuel needed to keep the lamp lit. And I'll start with just a candle that shows what one candle power looks like. Lighthouses up until the 1780s or so used what was a spider lamp, which just basically had a bunch of wicks like this floating in a bin of oil, and so it consumed a lot of oil. They were inefficient. They generated a lot of soot. So there was that kind of problem going on with it. With the advent of the argand lamp, which is that's what this is, an argand lamp. The argand lamp uses what is a tubular wick, and I'll just show you what that round wick looks like. So it's a wick, instead of just being one single wick, it's a round wick that goes around what is an open air basket that allows air to flow up on both sides of the wick. So when you light this, as I'm doing now, the wick lights all around, and I'll wait for that to get lit all the way around. And once that's done, then you put the chimney on, and you notice the difference in illumination. This is about 6 or 7 candle power. This is about, of course, 1 candle power. And so what resulted was a brighter light, less fuel being used, less generation of soot, and much more efficient. This development swept through Europe in the 1780s, early 1800s, became widely used in households and elsewhere, and was quickly adopted for lighthouses in England and in France. So this was an important development. Important enough that Thomas Jefferson, as I said in the introduction, liked the development so much, he shipped 3 of them back to the United States. He was so excited about it. In the early 1900s, the next development of the argan lamp was to add to the top of the lamp a mantle. And it's just a fiber mantle. It acts similar to what an incandescent light bulb works, so it just glows. And so I'll take this off and light that for you. And what this did was it took the argan lamp, brought it up to the next level of illumination. Bring that up a little bit. And again, this is an argan lamp with a tubular wick. And so it'll take a minute for that to get all the way around, and I'll drop the mantle on top, and you'll see what a difference that makes in the illumination. And you notice how inefficient the flame is right now? It's just burning, it's generating a lot of soot, it's yellow in color instead of white, and watch this change. Oop, I knocked it out. Do that. Let's do that again. So now you can see the difference in illumination that the addition of the mantle meant for the lighthouse. This is about 6 candle power, this is about 60 candle power. And when you add a lens to this, a Fresnel lens to this, it brings the 60 candle power up to 500 or 600 candle power. An enormous development from this simple single candle power lamp, maybe 5 or 6 of them, 10 or 12 of them in a bin of oil, all the way up to this. Much more efficient, it burns cleaner, uses less fuel, not much soot development, not much odor at all. So enormous development in a short period of time, 140 years from this to this. And what took over this was the electric light. And I'm going to put in front of this what is a pressed glass lens. It's built on the Fresnel lens technology, but it's a pressed glass lens. It's not a lighthouse Fresnel lens, but it'll still give you an idea of what adding a lens to the lamp does for the light itself. I'm just going to put this in place so I can put the lens in place in front of it. And so when you add that, you can see what that does to the illumination. It's capturing that light and it's directing it. So now you have, instead of one single light, you've got a band of light. So to the mariner now, they're seeing that as one flat band of light that extends out much further than this single lamp does. So again, it's adding that direction of light so it goes out to the mariner more efficiently, captures the light. And a Fresnel lens, if I had one, I wish I did have one, Fresnel lens, if I could show you that, it would be much more dramatic than that. As I said in the introduction, I've become fascinated with lighthouses, especially the Screwpile lighthouses of the James River. The lighthouses, there were a total of 4 Screwpile lighthouses. I'm going to touch on 2 other lighthouses that were in Hampton Roads as well, nearby, but I'm going to focus mainly on the 4 Screwpile lighthouses. The lighthouses were in place during a very interesting period in our nation's history. And the lighthouse keepers were witness to tremendous changes in our country. From the period of 1855 to 1935, there was enormous transition, enormous developments that went on in the country, enormous developments in lighthouse, lantern, lens technology. But outside of that, our country was going through great changes. In the lighthouse themselves, the fuel used to light the lamps changed from whale oil to what was called colza oil, to lard oil, to finally kerosene. So there's all those changes going on. During the same 80-year period, there were 2 principal wars. Of course, the Civil War that wrenched our country apart, and then World War I, lots of other smaller wars mixed in there, but those 2 principal wars during that 80-year period. There was the advent of steamship travel, particularly on the Chesapeake Bay, where steamship travel developed, went into its golden age in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then to their ultimate demise in the 1930s once train travel and the automobile came along and did away with steamships. So the lighthouses were there for all of that development period, and they added to the charm of the period as well. There was, of course, the invention in the early 1900s and wide adoption of the automobile, really taking place in the 1920s and 1930s. During that same 80-year period, there were 6 severe economic depressions in the United States. Of course, there was the Western expansion generated by the gold rush in the early 1850s, the push with railroads across our country during that period of time. Communication, think about what changed in communication during that period from 1855 to 1935. Morse code, the development of the telegraph to the telephone. There was the invention and then the wide adoption of the radio. So that period, that 80-year period, marked enormous changes in our country. And the lighthouse keepers and lighthouses went through that period of time. So I'm going to take us back now and do a very brief 5-minute history of lighthouses, because I think it's important to set the table that way and talk about what lighthouses were like up until the late 1700s, early 1800s. So it really started with the first lighthouse of note was Pharos of Alexandria. That was built in 305 BC by Ptolemy, just after Alexander the Great died. Built in Alexandria. And it was a stone structure about 110 meters high. And it was there from 300 BC to about almost 1500 BC. So a period of almost 1800 years that was in existence. And like all lighthouses of the period, it consisted of a large, tall stone structure with a big fire on top. And there are historical records of the lighthouse. There's all kinds of historic descriptions of the lighthouse. So we know fairly accurately what it looked like. And so this depiction is a fairly accurate depiction. But imagine what it was like, keeping that fire lighted all night, bring the wood fuel all the way 110 meters up to the top of that lighthouse, and keeping it lit. Imagine what the soot was like. Imagine what the smoke was like. It was very difficult. So at night this was lighted. There was a wood fire that kept it lighted. During the day it smoked. So during the day mariners looked for a column of smoke, and at night they looked for the light. A couple of other examples of early lighthouses. The one on the right is built by the Romans in 34 AD. That's current shot of the lighthouse that's still there at the Cliffs of Dover. Perhaps more interesting lighthouse was Tower of Hercules that was built in the northwest coast of Spain, in La Coruna, Spain. That was built in the 2nd century AD by the Roman Emperor Trajan. And believe it or not, it's still in use today. It was refurbished in 1790. But that lighthouse is still in use. They are no longer using wood fires or coal fires. They are using electric lamps, but it's interesting that that structure could be in place that long and still in use. So now we're going to go forward 1,800 years. So for 1,800 years, lighthouses were principally tall stone structures with a big fire on top. And mostly they marked the entrances to harbors. They did not mark shoals or problem points for mariners because they were too hard to get to at the time. They didn't have the technology to build lighthouses there at the time, so mostly they just marked entrances to harbors. That changed in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Eddystone Light was built to mark a dangerous shoal off the coast of England. And that light used candles and spider lamps, which I've shown you more about that in another part of the presentation. In the late 1700s, another lighthouse was built in Cordovan Light. Now that used argan lamps from the beginning. And that was built off the Brittany coast of France. So lamp development during that period of time, first of all, the fuel that was used, as I mentioned earlier, first was whale oil, then colza oil, that's a derivative of rapeseed oil, then lard oil was used, and that was fully converted to kerosene in the late 1800s. Now whale oil, it's kind of interesting, whale oil was used up until about 1850s when it became harder and harder to get and also more and more expensive. Whale oil in the 1850s was $2.50 a gallon. That's equivalent to $64 a gallon today. So, as I said, it became too expensive to use. The argan lamp was developed in the late 1700s and quickly adopted throughout Europe for lighthouses. It was adopted in the United States as well. And in the early 1800s, again, a gentleman by the name of Winslow Lewis adopted the argan design and developed it into his own lamp that he patented and then sold to the U.S. Lighthouse Service. So if you look at this next slide and look at the centered picture on the bottom, that's what the Lewis lamp looked like. And it consisted of the argan lamp in the center with a parabolic reflector behind it and then a convex lens in front of it. And if you look at the depictions just above that, it shows how those lamps were actually used, where they would get a circular ring of those, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11 of those, depending on how much light they wanted to put out. There were problems with those lamps, though. One of them was that keeping the lens, the convex lens, clean and in its correct place was difficult. Light keepers felt that they were ineffective. So ultimately, they dropped the convex lens, and they just kept the parabolic reflector and the argan lamp. This is what an argan lamp looks like. These are for a 4th order Fresnel lens. I've shown you elsewhere how they work. And this is a lamp that added the mantle technology to it, as I've shown you in my other depiction. So that's a development of the lamp technology. On the lens side, Augustin Fresnel was a French scientist, actually an engineer, who worked on developing the Fresnel lens. And he believed that you could move the lens from the simple convex design into something that was more efficient. And what he did was he put in a series of prisms that more efficiently directed the light, so that instead of having a big, heavy convex lens that had a long focal length that was hard to cast accurately, he put in place a series of circular series of prisms that was much more efficient and captured more of the light. That was quickly adopted throughout England and France in the early 1820s. By the way, Augustine Fresnel died in 1827 before he was able to see the widespread adoption of his invention. But the impact that he has had on lighthouse technology, and not just on lighthouses, but the wide use of Fresnel technology, is still in use today. Most commonplace you'll see a Fresnel lens is on the tail lights of automobiles. As you look at the car in front of you, you realize that that is a form of a Fresnel lens. The lens was important because it increased the efficiency of the captured light. The Lewis lamp captured about 20%. The Fresnel lens captured about 85%. So it was much more efficient in capturing and throwing that light out to the mariner so they could see it in a broader range of lighting conditions. The Fresnel lens was not adopted in the United States. The Lighthouse Board resisted it. Mr. Lewis had contracts with the Lighthouse Board to supply all of the lighthouses with his Lewis lamps. There was a strong feeling with the Lighthouse Board at that point that the Fresnel lens was too expensive, and that the added expense wasn't worthy of the increase in efficiency and increased lighting. So that was a problem. The first Fresnel lenses were not adopted in the United States until 1841 at Navesink Light in New Jersey. But even after that, there was still resistance until Congress got involved, and they demanded an investigation of the Lighthouse Service, and they produced a report that showed there were widespread inefficiencies and that changes needed to be made. So they created a Lighthouse Board. They basically fired all the old people that were there, and they demanded adoption of the Fresnel lens throughout the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And this is what a Fresnel lens looks like for lighthouses. First order lens is used in the largest lighthouses, like Hatteras Light down in North Carolina, Minot's Ledge up in Massachusetts. They were very tall, they were very heavy, very expensive to construct. But an argand lamp combined with a first order lens increased the candle power to about 80,000. So I showed you elsewhere that a mantle lantern would throw out about 60 candle power. Adding a first order lens to that increased it to about 80,000 candle power. The lighthouses of the James River used at first the sixth order lens, which is the smallest lens, just about a foot and a half tall. And then they later adopted the fifth order lens because it threw more light out and was better lens for their locations. I had to throw this slide in there as a point of humor. This, of course, is the Costa Concordia in Italy that went aground a little over a year ago. And the skipper didn't understand that rule of thumb, and that is that the lighthouse always has right of way. So now we'll talk about the James River lighthouses. And I'm going to quickly, I'll show you where the lighthouses were located just so you can get grounded in their relative locations. Starting at the top is Deepwater Shoals, that's just off what is currently Fort Eustis. Going south is Point of Shoals in Burwell Bay. Next one down is White Shoal Light, and that was located just off the mouth of the Pagan River. Further south, at the mouth of the Nancy River, of course, is Nansemond River Light. Middle Ground Light was built in the 1890s. That's a Cashion-style lighthouse right in the middle of Hampton Roads. And then marking the entrance to the Elizabeth River is Craney Island Light. So we're going to go through Craney Island Light and Middle Ground Light fairly quickly, and then we'll go on to the James River lighthouses. So what was it about Screwpile Lighthouses that was so effective, and why was that design adopted so widely throughout the Chesapeake Bay, elsewhere as well, but principally in the Chesapeake Bay? It was developed in the 1830s. A Scot by the name of Alexander Mitchell invented the screwpile, and it was a major improvement because what it allowed was an effective driving of the pile without having to have a pile driver in place. So a team of men could put the pile in place. The United States became interested in it. He came over to the United States and helped construct what was then is still now Brandywine Shoal in Delaware Bay. So that was built in 1828. I'm sorry, in 1848. Before that, there was a lightship in place. There was another lighthouse that was in place, but that was destroyed by ice flows. So they put this one in place. It cost $53,000, which was a high expense for a Screwpile lighthouse at the time. But they had to put some extensive bottom work in place in order to make sure the lighthouse didn't get wiped away by ice flows later on. They were effective, as I said, because a team of men could drive the piles without having to have a mechanical device to do that. So typically they would build a platform, and they'd drive a center pile, and then they just drive the other piles around that. They quickly became adopted throughout the Chesapeake Bay in the 1850s, but after the close of the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, they really became widely used and spread throughout the Chesapeake. Most of them were made with iron piles. Some were made with wooden piles, and believe it or not, they would actually carve into the bottom of the wooden pile a screw, and then they'd use that to go down into the bottom. Most of the early designs were square in shape. The structure itself and the lighthouse were square in shape, but they later adopted an octagonal design. The experience through the 1800s, late 1800s, with Screwpile lighthouses had one principal flaw, and that was that they were subject to damage by ice flows. During severe winters, when the rivers were frozen, often frozen, when the river broke away and the ice started to flow, that ice banging against that iron structure was a problem. It shook the lighthouse and sometimes just swept them away, often caused severe damage. There were about 100 cottage-style lighthouses built. Most were built around the Chesapeake Bay. About 50 were built around the Chesapeake Bay and North Carolina. There were some up in Long Island, some in the Great Lakes, a few in the Gulf of Mexico. And this shows what the Screwpile lighthouse Screwpile itself design looked like. There were a few different designs, but basically they had that flanged screw at the bottom. If you look to the left, you can see how they drove the piles into the mud. They'd build that platform. A team of men would form around the capstan, and they just go around circles, driving that down into the bottom. So this next shows what a typical square early Screwpile lighthouse looked like. Very simple design, usually just single story with the lantern room at the top. So they were pretty simple to build. And this next slide just shows in 1854 there was a drive to put the lighthouses in place in the James River. In particular, at one point, and that was at Point of Shoals at Burwell Bay, because that was a dangerous navigation point for commercial traffic going up and down the river. This shows a depiction of the Coast Survey of 1862. The soundings and all for this were done in the late 1850s, and this map was published in 1862. And the next slide will show an enlargement of part of the map, which depicts the three Screwpile lighthouses of the James River, starting at the top with Deepwater Shoals, next south Point of Shoals and Burwell Bay, and then the third one, White Shoals, just off the mouth of the Pagan River. So next I'm going to go on to Craney Island Lighthouse. This is not a James River lighthouse, but I thought it'd be worth just touching it briefly so we could enlighten you a little bit about this lighthouse. It was an important lighthouse. In the 1820s, there was a lightship constructed at the mouth of the Elizabeth River. And of course, we know lightships were expensive to build. They took a lot of manpower to staff, and they were subject to storms. So that lighthouse was replaced by a Screwpile Lighthouse in 1859. And at first it was a square design, and that was later replaced by the design that you see here. That photograph was taken in the 1820s, and that's the octagonal lighthouse that replaced the earlier square lighthouse. Another point to be made, and I'll touch on this again later on, but all of the lighthouses that were in place during the Civil War were attacked by Confederates during the early years of the war, late 1862, 1863. And the Confederates did that because they wanted to snuff out all the lighthouses so that the Union embargo, Union blockade would have less advantage. The Confederates felt like they had more local knowledge of the rivers, and so they didn't want the Union forces to have any advantage in having the lighthouses lighted. So they systematically snuffed them out all the way from the Potomac River down to the Gulf of Mexico. They weren't relighted again until usually around 1863, when Union forces started to control the waterways. Next, I'll touch just for a minute on Middle Ground Light. This was built in the middle of Hampton Roads, just south of Newport News. It was built there because ships leaving the harbor there at Newport News, leaving the docks, often ran aground. And so they put this light in place to help them with that. It was a Cashin-style light, again built in 1891. It's the oldest Cashin-style light that was built in Virginia. It needed about 1,000 tons of riprap around its base in order to protect it from ships that could potentially bang into it, and to protect it from erosion from the currents. Cost about $50,000 when it was built in the 1890s. That has 5 levels, starting with a basement, then a living level, main level, and then equipment level, and then the watch room and lantern room at the top. This was sold by the Coast Guard in 2005 to a Williamsburg couple. And before that, they tried to get lighthouse organizations, preservation organizations interested in buying it, and no one was interested. So the Gunsulin family of Williamsburg bought it, and they're using it now as a vacation home. And they've completely refurbished it. Okay, we'll go on to the other James River lighthouses, starting with White Shoal Lighthouse, which is just off the mouth of the Nansemond River. All 3 of these lighthouses were lighted at the same time in 1855. They all used the same hexagonal design. The bottom structures varied depending on what the shoal was like, but they all used the same hexagonal design. And if you look at the lighthouse, look at that picture of the lighthouse, you see that it was basically all white. The roof was red. The lantern deck was white. The railings were white, and the roof on top of the cupola was black. And you always see that all of the cupola lighthouses throughout the lighthouse service were always black. And this is the 1878 plat, showing the location of White Shoals and the lighthouse location. That red circle at the top right is the 5-acre layout for the lighthouse location. Let's see, at first, all of those lighthouses, White Shoal, Deepwater Shoals, and Point of Shoals, all had a large pressed glass lens instead of a Fresnel lens. Now, the Fresnel lens was adopted later on, but initially they just had a pressed glass lens. Confederates raided White Shoal Lighthouse, as they did all the lighthouses. It wasn't all that well built. And in 1869, it was leaning badly to one side, and they had to completely replace it in 1871. When they replaced it, they put in place a 5th-order Fresnel lens. It was sold and discontinued in 1934, and in its place, they put an automated light with a steel skeleton tower. And that structure survived until 1977. There was a derelict from the 1930s until then, and it got in worse and worse shape. But ice flows in 1977 completely took it away. So it was the longest lasting of all of the James River lighthouses. This shows it in 1928, which is curious because all of the documentation I have says that the lighthouse operated until 1934. And yet this picture, which I got from the Mariners Museum, was dated 1928. So that's a point about doing this research I've found is you get conflicting facts depending on your sources, and you have to resolve those conflicts because you can't just depend on any one. You've got to get confirmation of what the dates are. And this is just one example. I don't know what the correct date is for that lighthouse being shut down, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't 1934. Next is Point of Shoals, and Point of Shoals was located in Burwell Bay, in what you might take as a surprising location, because when you look at the James River, if you look across the James River at that point, the location of the lighthouse is pretty close to shore. But it was built there because the shoal, Point of Shoals, was a very large shoal that took up almost all of the James River at that point. So the main channel of the river swung very close to shore and followed the contour of Burwell Bay. So this shows what the plat was, the 1870 plat for that lighthouse. And it shows the location of the lighthouse far to the left of Burwell Bay. But that's where that channel swung at that point. And you imagine being a skipper of a boat trying to go up or down river, and how you had to navigate that narrow channel and stay away from that shoal. Because the shoal, you can't see it in this slide, but it went from about 30 feet to about 4 feet in just a matter of yards. So for people trying to navigate up and down the river, that was one of the more dangerous points. And this next quote was from the first person that really lobbied for getting a lighthouse at Point of Shoals, Captain Alexander Claxton, in 1837. He said that Point of Shoals was considered the most dangerous situation on the James River. That's a direct quote from him. So it was finally built in 1855 along with the 2 other lighthouses. Confederates raided that lighthouse as well as they did all the others. 1871, the lighthouse was severely damaged by ice flows, rebuilt that same year. It was automated until in about 1932, and the lighthouse itself was deactivated in 1933. The channel since then was moved to the far right side of the James River, more efficient instead of having to go all the way around Burwell Bay, but it is a dredged channel. It's not a natural channel. The cottage was torn down in the 1960s, but the pilings still remain. That's a picture I took just a couple of weeks ago, showing the pilings from 1871 still in existence. Okay, next, going further upriver is Deepwater Shoals Light. This is a picture from 1885, and you can see the structure is the same as the other lighthouses. All white painted except with a red roof, black cupola roof. This one is fitted with a bell. The others were not initially fitted, but they were later fitted with bells. And if you look closely enough, you can see a lightning strap extending from the lantern deck on down side of the roof. That ball at the top of the lighthouse served a couple of functions. There was a rod extending upward from it, but the ball had at its bottom, you can't obviously see it, but there were 3/4 inch or 1 inch diameter holes that acted as vents for the gases coming up from the lighthouse lantern. So all that gas had to go up through somewhere, so it all went up through that little vent. Go on to the next slide. And this shows the plat location of Deepwater Shoal. It's currently off what is now Fort Eustis, just north of Fort Eustis. That also started with a pressed glass masthead lens, replaced in 1868 with a sixth-order Fresnel lens. And it was a fixed white light, and I'll comment on that a little bit. All of the lights initially were fixed white lights, which means that they had a white light showing all the way around the lighthouse. Later on, a couple of them adopted red sector lights. So what they put in place was a red panel, so that when mariners were going up river, if they saw a red panel, they could tell by the red panel, or the red light that they were seeing, that they were heading for dangerous waters. So they'd steer away from that red light. Nansen River Light had a fixed red light all the way around. Deepwater Shoals, of course, as I said earlier, was attacked by the Confederates in 1862. The lighthouse board took the lamp away and moved it to Fort Monroe until Union forces gained control of the James River, and they were able to put it back in 1863. The lighthouse was deactivated in 1936, and I put a question mark there for a reason I'll share with you in a minute. Torn down in 1966, and it was replaced by an automated structure. The reason I put a question mark by that date of 1936 is because everything I've read, from all the books I've read about that lighthouse, say it was shut down and stopped being used in 1836. But my research has turned up the Lighthouse Journal for Deepwater Shoals, which shows it's still being operated in 1944. So that, again, that's conflicting facts that we still have yet to resolve. But we know from the journal that Deepwater Shoals was still operating at least till May 1944. I'm going to back up just for a minute to comment about the lighthouse design. If you look at the top of the lighthouse, at the lantern glass, you can see what looks like curtains behind the glass. And now I've got to do more research on this, so this is a little bit dangerous talking about this because I'm not certain, but I believe the curtains were in place to prevent birds from running into the glass. There was a very common problem among lighthouses where birds crashing into the clear glass. And so there were a lot of different fixes that they tried to put in place, and curtains behind the glass during the day was one of the fixes that they used. So you can fairly clearly see that in this picture. This is part of the research I did were reports that were directly sent from the Lighthouse Board to the Secretary of Treasury. And this one just shows the condition of the lighthouses and the adoption of the lighthouses in 1855. Another bit of research just showing you some of the sources that I've used to collect the facts that I'm depicting here. Okay, we'll go on to the next lighthouse upriver, and that's Jordan Point Lighthouse. And that lighthouse sits on a point, a Jordan Point, which stretches well out into the James River. And this one, of course, is built on land, as shown. At first, it was just a light on top of the house that's shown there, and then they later built that lighthouse structure. Next, going north, is Dutch Gap Canal. This is not too far south of Richmond. There was a bend in the river that had to be navigated if you're going up to Richmond, and for a long time people thought about digging a canal so they could shorten the trip needed. Well, the Civil War drove that a little bit because if you look to the left, those red markings there were Confederate batteries. So for Union troops to try to get upriver, they had to go by those batteries, which of course was a problem. So they decided to dig this canal. And they dug the canal and finished it in just before the end of the war in 1844. But it was never actually used. And the reason for that was that after they dug the canal, both ends of the canal they had left with a dam, and so to open up the canal, they had to blow up the dams at either end. When they did that, all the debris blew into the canal, shoaled it, and it never was used during the Civil War. It was finished in 1871, and it's still in use today. Okay, we'll go to Nansen River Light. This is a picture from 1885 showing its initial design, its initial coloring. It was all white with a red roof, white railings on the top with a black cupola roof. And I haven't noted this earlier. I've left this until now. There's one thing about all of the old photographs that's very interesting to me that I have to research more, and that is you never see a U.S. flag. Now, these were all federal properties, and so in none of the old lighthouse photographs I've seen, I've looked at many, there's not one U.S. flag. And why, I don't know. So there's more research to be done about that, but it's just a curious fact about all those lighthouses. This is a later picture, sometime in the 1920s, and you can see the coloring has changed. The shutters are now, you can't tell from this black and white photo, but most likely green. They could paint them either green or red by White House specifications. The railings were then black, and of course the glass all around the lantern was red. And it was all around red from the beginning, from its installation. And this shows the original plat, the 1877 plat, with the location just off Pig Point. It was 3/5 of a mile north of Pig Point and due east of Barrel Point, just at the mouth of the James River. And that shoal was a very dangerous shoal, especially for steamships coming from Norfolk or from Newport News, because the river there at that point went from about 30 feet or so deep to about 4 feet deep in just a matter of yards. So that's why they adopted that location. And this next slide shows a more modern map with what would have been its location, just more north of what was TC, the Tidewater Community Campus in North Suffolk. And I'm showing this as one of the sources of information that I've used to gather facts about Nansen River Light. And what this is depicting, I'll go on to the next one, is the development of the lighthouse construction. And the construction went very fast. It wasn't started until July of 1878, and it was lighted November 1st of 1878. So a little better than 4 months it took to put the piles in place, construct the cottage, and get the lantern lighted. And these are the plans that so fascinated me that I felt like I had to build this lighthouse. This is a top view of the plans, and this is the side view. And when I built the lighthouse, I built it exactly according to these plans at a 1/2-inch scale. This shows the interior layout Those blocks at the top and the bottom were the 4 cisterns that held the water that ran off from the roof. Lower left was the kitchen and sitting room, and that's where the potbelly stove was located. Then to the right of that were 2 bedrooms adjacent to each other. And then to the left of that was the storeroom. And right in the center, with all of these lighthouses, was a circular staircase. And then there were also shelves and other things that were that housed the library. And a comment about that too, every lighthouse had a little library. And the library was vital to the lighthouse keepers. And they changed them out about once a month. So when the tenders came to give them supplies and everything, a common comment in the lighthouse logbook was change the library. The lighthouse itself was built at Lazaretto Point in Maryland, and then it was brought down by barge to its location. Part of the lighthouse foundation came from Roanoke Marshes Lighthouse down in North Carolina. And this was active, I'll go on to the next slide. The sum appropriated by Congress to build a lighthouse in 1876 was $15,000. The location of the lighthouse had to be deeded by the state of Virginia over to the federal government. That was done in 1877. Rufus Potter was the first lightkeeper, starting in March 1879. His salary was $575 a year. That's equivalent to about $14,000 today, which sounds like, man, a guy's doing all that work for $14,000? Now, he was supplied with food and board, naturally, but $575 a year was his salary. And just looking at the personnel records, that $575 didn't change much until about 1906, 1907. So for a more than 25-year period, they were paid $575, and that was it. We're continuing to do research, but the names of the lighthouse keepers that we have so far go up until about 1911, 1912. After that, the records are in the Coast Guard's personnel department in St. Louis, and they're less, the records are less accessible than the records previous to that up in Washington. So Rufus Potter was first, followed by several people, then Eugene M. Edwards, 1891 to 1906. His wife also served as lightkeeper. She also served as assistant keeper for him for a period of time before she came over as lighthouse keeper. Now we've got more research to do on all the lighthouse keepers. We've gathered some of their genealogy records from census records, voting records, and so on, so we know who they were, where they were, how long they lived, and who their families were, and we're now gathering some more information to see if we can get some stories, more personal stories about each of them. So what was life like for light keepers? It was a tough life. It was very demanding. The Lighthouse Board was very strict in how they had to keep their lighthouses in order. They had monthly inspections. They had to keep all of the maintenance up, all the painting, keeping of the lamp, the roof, the structure itself. So when I read the logbooks, many of the entries were about them scraping and painting. Reading the logbooks also and the personnel records, there was quite a bit of turnover among the lighthouse keepers, but more so with the assistant keepers. Many of them were dismissed for various reasons. Many were promoted. Some just resigned. But the tenure of the keepers and their assistants wasn't all that long because it was a tough life. And this is I've just put here some of the quotes from the Lighthouse Keeper Rule Book and the requirements that they had for all the things they had to do to run their lighthouse. An interesting thing there was lighthouse keepers may leave their stations to attend divine worship on Sundays. to procure needed supplies or on important public occasions. Never could be left unattended naturally, so the keeper and his assistant were always swapping off when they left. Another, I haven't shown this here, but another requirement of the Lighthouse Board was that Sundays, lighthouse keepers were required to allow anyone who wanted to tour the lighthouse to come on board. So on Sundays, you could go up with your sailboat, stop in and say, I'd like to take a tour of your lighthouse. And they were required to accommodate them. This is a letter from the Navy Secretary to the Secretary of the Treasury requesting the dismissal of one of the assistant lighthouse keepers. And the reason for the dismissal is the assistant keeper was taking frequent and prolonged absences from the station without leave and without providing a substitute, for failing to furnish an explanation when asked to do so by the inspector of the 5th District. So they were tough on their keepers and assistant keepers. This is a logbook from February 1912. And you won't be able to read all of these entries, but I'll just paraphrase some of them. Starting February 1, the first entry was cold all day. A couple of entries down was river frozen from shore to lighthouse. A couple of entries down from that is river frozen all the way across. Temperatures, thermometer down to 14 degrees, thermometer down to 16 degrees, thermometer down to 26 degrees. And this is day after day after day. And so again, these lighthouses, light stations were not insulated. They had one potbelly stove in the center of the lighthouse. And so imagine what it was like at night for them. Wasn't very comfortable. Also, lower down, the ice apparently begins to break up a bit and starts to flow. And so they comment about the lighthouse being shaken, severely shaken as the ice flows past the lighthouse and bangs into the foundation. And there's one depiction I read in another lighthouse where the keeper and his assistant had to hold on because the light station was being shaken so severely. So imagine what that was like in a cold February night, black as ink outside, can't see anything, and you're sitting in this structure shaking away. I mean, it had to be tough for those people. So what did the inside look like? These were taken from a lighthouse at Solomon's Island in Maryland, and just shows what the interior looked like as accurate depiction. Shows on top right photo is the sitting area and kitchen with the potbelly stove. Lower left is the bell mechanism. I'll comment on that in the next slide. And then lower right is what the bedroom typically looked like. The bell, they were all fitted with bells, later foghorns, but initially just bells. And they were required to keep the bells ringing during any period of fog. And the way they did that was they used a clockwork bell striker, and this is one of the typical designs. It ran just like a clock, so there were weights that were attached to it. They had to wind it up, and after they wound it and they touched it off, the bell would ring for about 2 hours before they had to wind it up again. Every lighthouse had a distinctive ring pattern to it. A Nansen River light rang every 7 seconds. And that was marked in the chart. So for mariners going upriver, if they heard a bell ringing, they could listen to it, time it, and they knew that Nansen River light was just off over there in the fog. Imagine what that was like for the light keepers. They had to keep that running sometimes for hours on end, that bell clanging away, banging away, no escape from it. Okay, next is to go on to building the model. And as I said, I became fascinated with the structure itself when I picked up the plans from Carla Smith and gave them to me on loan. Took a while to figure out how I was going to do it exactly, but finally started off. And And actually started with a base and then the piling structures. And these are done in plastic, PVC plastic, to the right scale for the pilings that were used. And adding the connecting rods was a bit difficult at first because I had to find the right scale turnbuckles. Because details in a model like that are extremely important. If it's not done correctly, one's eye picks it up, will pick it up right away. And so it took me a while. I finally found a supply of the correct scale turnbuckles down in North Carolina. And I drilled and tapped them and put them all in place. And these are actually working turnbuckles. So they're not just there for visual effect. They're all tensioned correctly to make the pilings stand up correctly. Next was putting it all together and then starting to build the deck. Again, using the plans and following the plans exactly for all the beams that were required for the deck. It just shows the progression of adding those joists in place, all the gluing work that had to be done, and the nail work that had to be done. This shows the deck nearly complete, and the spiral staircase that's in the center. And my wife Nancy said, "What are you putting that in place? Nobody's ever going to see that." But if the model is going to be accurate, it has to have that in place. So now I've started to add the interior walls and the lighting, and the deck itself is complete on the outside, and I've left the space there for the walls to be put in place, the outside walls to be put in place. Now I've got the walls in place up in the top photograph. Interior walls are all done except for some detailing. Exterior walls, I've got the windows in place and now the shutters. Now I've added the interior doors and I've got all the interior detailing done. Furniture hasn't been moved in yet, but the walls and detailing is complete. And then lower right, I'm working on completing the railings and then starting on the roof structure. I had to take a break from that, so I wanted to build the dory that was used to get it to and from the lighthouse. So I did that with a carving process where you first create a template and then basically carve out the exterior design first and then carve the interior to match that. So you do that by starting with a template, laying it out to stations, and then carving out each station to the correct dimensions, and then just carving out the hull to match that. So this is what it looks like closer to being finished. That was actually fun to build. It was a method that I had not yet tried, but I found the method from a British model builder, and I just adopted his method, and it turned out to be a really effective means of building an accurate model to that scale. So we'll go on now to show first floor is completed, the ceiling is completed for the first floor, and I'm starting to build the second story. So the roof joists are in place, the fascia beams are in place. Now I've put the sheathing on for the roof, and then the simulated metallic roofing. That's a plastic that I used for that roofing, but it's simulating the metal roof that was actually in place. And here I've started to build the lantern deck. That's pretty well complete. In the lower right, I've started to build the parapet structure and the lantern. Here the lantern's room is mostly done and starting to build the structure for the cupola roof. And then this, the simulating accurately to scale the Fresnel lens took some doing. It took me a while to figure out how to do that, but I basically started by turning a block of wood to show what the Fresnel lens dimensions looked like. Then I poured casting material around that to make a mold, and then from that mold I poured in clear acrylic resin to make the simulated Fresnel lens. So that picture in the lower right is how it looked as it came out of the mold. And going on, just finishing up the cupola roof, what it looked like with its framing, and then lower right with the panels put in place. And then upper left side, the finished roof and the mounting for the Fresnel lens in place and ready for to put the Fresnel lens on. Lower right, I've started to build the davits for the boat lifts, and I've got the winch in place. And that's about it. That really concludes my talk. This has been a fascinating study for me, starting with the building of the model and then advancing from there into an understanding and a study of the James River lighthouses, especially the Screwpile lighthouses, the lamps and lanterns that were used, the lenses that were used. So it's been a wonderful adventure, and I'm happy to share it with you here today.